I was about to drive home after playing a round of golf when my Tesla wouldn't start. All I heard was a clicking sound when I started the ignition.
U.S. war with
First, I
Iran
checked the
is
battery
still
by
very,
checking the
very
headlights.
possible. That's right. The United States could very easily today, tomorrow, this year,
The headlights were pretty bright, so I knew the battery was okay. The next step in the troubleshooting was to test the starter. Luckily, I remembered 25 years ago, my cousin's husband taught me how to test a starter by shorting the starter terminal with the battery terminal using a screwdriver. But first, I had to disable the immobilizer. As you know, Tesla has a very strong security system. I even need an app to open the dashboard.
Это
Let me show
ну
you
вот
how to
первая как
disable
бы
the security
полоса,
system.
которая
You
была от
simply log in to the
границы с
Tesla app
Россией,
by
вот там
entering your
очень сильные
password
обстрелы были, там просто все разбивали.
Ayan
И она все это время на
Quango.
неделю, даже больше, наверное, 2 недели, она просто под
Enter.
обстрелами, без электричества, без отопления.
Now that the security system is disabled, I can open the dashboard.
More than 500,000 Red Army soldiers had become encircled around
To
Vyazma
test the
and
starter,
Bryansk.
I switched the ignition to the engine on position. Then, I shorted the starter terminal and the battery terminal of the starter solenoid with a screwdriver. If you ever try to do this, make sure you never touch the metal part of the screwdriver. Note the noise is from the radiator fan which I wired to the engine on terminal of the ignition switch. Now that I know there is nothing wrong with the starter, the next step in the troubleshooting is to test the ignition switch and wirings. With my Tesla, it should be just a quick 15-minute job. If the switch is bad and there are no parts available, no problem. I can just MacGyver any push-button switch I can buy from any electronic component store. If the switch is good, that means there is a problem with the wiring or connections. Instead of spending lots of time doing continuity checks to pinpoint the exact location of the disconnection in the wiring, I will just lazily run a bypass wire from the ignition to the starter. By the way, if the terminals of your starter are too far apart from each other, you can use a jumper cable by clamping one end to the positive terminal of the battery and clamp the other end to the screwdriver. Then just touch the starter terminal with the tip of the screwdriver. Here's the jumper cable that I made out of leftover wires when they installed an aircon in my living room. I keep it in the trunk of my car in case of emergency. When I got home, I immediately removed the panels. I only had to remove 8 screws. I don't need a wiring diagram. I can just use my old crappy multimeter and do trial and error to find the hot terminal or the terminal that is always connected to the positive terminal of the battery. I don't have alligator clips, so I just inserted the ground lead of the multimeter inside one of the screw holes. Then I probed each terminal with the positive lead of the multimeter to find out which one is connected to the battery. After I determined which one is the battery terminal, it was easy to determine which one is the starter terminal by process of elimination. That's because I knew the accessories terminal was okay because the radio was working, and I knew the engine on terminal was okay because the radiator fan was working. I had to hook up one of the multimeter LEDs to the battery terminal, but I don't have alligator clips. No problem. I simply connected a 10 gauge wire and bent one of the ends so it will eep it inside the connector. Now that one of the LED of the multimeter is firmly connected to the battery terminal, I can have fun doing tusluk on the other terminals to test for continuity. Even if I knew the accessories and engine on terminals were working, I still needed to identify them so that if the ignition switch passes the continuity tests, I will know where to connect the bypass wire. First, I placed the switch in the off position and made sure none of the other terminals were connected to the battery terminal. Then, I placed the switch in the accessories on position and probed each terminal. The ohmmeter dial slapped when I probed the terminal right beside the battery terminal, which means that was the accessories terminal. Then I placed the switch in the engine on position. The ohmmeter dial slapped when I probed the terminal right below the accessories on terminal, which means that was the engine on terminal. Then I held the keys in the start or last position when I probed the last two remaining terminals. The ohmmeter dial slapped when I probed the terminal right below the empty slot of the connector, which means the ignition switch is working and the wire below the empty slot is the wire that is supposed to connect to the starter. Since the ignition switch was working, that means there was a problem with the wiring. So I cut that wire and connected it to one end of the bypass wire, which I took out from a broken lampshade. I ran the bypass wire through this cockroach hole. I call this the cockroach hole because I think it's the hole the cockroaches use to go inside my car. I was on a date with this Korean lady when she suddenly started screaming and stomping her feet. I immediately knew it was a cockroach climbing up her leg, so I pulled over to the side of the road. She got out of my car, jumping up and down, screaming. I traced the starter wire to this connector. I did a continuity check from the starter to this connector, and the connection was good. I temporarily connected the bypass wire to one of the multimeter LEDs to do a continuity check between this connector and the starter terminal at the ignition switch. There was no connection. That means this is where I should connect the bypass wire. Out of laziness, I simply inserted the other end of the bypass wire into the female slot of the connector so it will become EPIT when I put the connector back together. All I need to do now is test it. The sound of the engine cranking after troubleshooting and fixing is the greatest feeling in my sad and pathetic life. Perfect.